Hi Lorna, how are you?
Good morning, Kieran. I'm just going to make you the presenter 1 second.
Yes,
I just
no
want to
worries.
do this first and foremost. There we go. Hello.
That's us.
There we go.
Um, Let me see. Can I just double check, Lorna, before anybody else comes in that this is working properly? So,
Yep.
um, see where it's gone. Can you can you see Lorna the slides and me?
Yep. They're front and center. They look good.
And are the slides moving?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I can
no,
see you
that's
flicking
grand.
through there.
I was doing some training yesterday, and for some reason, I was kind of about 5 slides in, and someone says, "Do you know it's still showing the cover page for us?" I was like, "I've no
Oh.
idea how it's done that." So, no,
No, it looks good.
that's great. How are you? Keeping busy?
Yeah, busy. I was off last week, so I've got a lot to catch up on.
Very good. Yeah, I was off
Yeah,
as well. Did you do anything nice?
yeah, cinema, trick-or-treating, kids keep me busy.
That's it. It's a good, fun time of year. Hello, Em. How are you?
Morning, I'm
Emma.
fine. Hello, sorry I'm late. Well, yeah. Are you all right then?
Good. Yes, Lorna's just keeping me in shape here and getting everything set up. So I think we're
Oh,
all
she's
good.
fantastic,
Um,
Alona, isn't she? Thank you.
All
she's doing a
right.
bang up job.
I'll let some of the team in, 'cause some of the team are trying to get in.
No worries, folks. Can
Brilliant.
I just check? Remind me, did we want a comfort break in the middle or not, or just crack on for 2 hours, or do 5 minute break?
I prefer a 5 minute break if that's all right.
Yeah, yeah, no problem at all. So I'll just set my alarm quickly here. Um, I think that is a good idea because yeah. It's a long time otherwise. Make sure that's on silent. Yes, no, that sounds like a plan. So we've got a good bit to get through today, but I'll try and leave some time for questions and also then um may also see some things popping up as we go along.
No worries, thank you.
Right. If that's all right with you, Kieran and Emma, I'll start letting people in.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
crack on. Thanks,
Yeah.
Lorna.
Okay. Just to let you know, we've got about 70 accepted today, so you've got a bit of an audience.
Great.
Okay. Let's.
Morning, everybody. We will get started in a moment. Nice to see you all.
Morning.
Folks, can everybody just make sure you're on mute, please? Morning to everybody joining. We're just giving everybody a little moment to come on board and then we'll get cracking. Nice to see you all. Shall we make a start, Em?
Yeah, so welcome everyone, and thanks for attending the third in a six-part series on the Procurement Act 23 and a refresher. It is bonfire night, so I do hope you've all brought your bonfire toffee. And yeah, so this session will look at designing a competitive, flexible procedure, evaluation and potential negotiation, flexibility to amend and record keeping. We're joined again by our wonderful Kieran, who will professionally lead us through, and from sort of the perspective of a procurement professional. They're always a delight to watch and very informative. So I'll hand over to Kieran now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Em. I paid Em to say all that for anybody wondering. So that the check is in the post, Em. No, very kind joking aside. Appreciate the very kind feedback, and great to see lots of people on the call again. So yes, as Em says, folks, we've got an action-packed session today. We're going to be looking at designing a competitive, flexible procedure. We'll then move on to look at evaluation and the scoring of bids. And last but not least, we will also look at record keeping. I always say to people, record keeping is not the kind of sexy side of public procurement, but it is really, really important. I was at a conference a few years ago, and I remember someone saying there's a lot to be said for doing the boring things well. And I think that's really true. So whilst the competitive flexible procedure is new and exciting, don't take your eye off the ball in terms of doing the basics well, in terms of getting your evaluation right, having robust record keeping, etc., etc. So, apologies, I'm sure many of you are sick of the sight of this slide by now, but for anybody who's joining today for the first time, you're very welcome. As Em says, my name is Kieran McGaughey. I'm a consultant solicitor specialising in public procurement law. I also deliver legal training in particular on the new Procurement Act. That's my LinkedIn profile. Some of you I recognise are connected on LinkedIn already, but you're very welcome to connect on there if you use LinkedIn. A lot of the sort of things that I'll be talking about today, I'm usually ranting and raving about on LinkedIn. So you're very welcome to connect. So some housekeeping, yeah, if everybody could put themselves on mute, I think everyone is, so that's great. Thanks for that. Questions are very, very welcome indeed. I know the team are keen to make these sessions as interactive and informative as possible for efficiency North members. So if you do have a question, feel free to put that in the chat. And we'll also hopefully have we've got a busy agenda today, but I am hoping we will have some time for questions at the end. We're also, folks, going to have a 5-minute comfort break around 11 o'clock. And you can hopefully stretch your legs, or if you're quicker than me, make a quick cup of tea or coffee. So yes, look out for that at 11 o'clock, and then we'll be back to it with the remainder of the session. So first things first then, designing a competitive, flexible procedure. So back to basics, I'm sure many people are aware of this already. What is the competitive, flexible procedure? Probably just pinch this guy off Getty Images, but he looks very flexible indeed. Under the Procurement Act, there are now only 2 competitive procedures available. Number 1 is the open procedure. I'm sure everybody on the call is very familiar with the open procedure, but just to recap, that is really a single stage procurement where everybody can bid. So it's, the clue is in the title, it's open. You publish your tender and tender documents, you wait something beyond the minimum legal timeframes, people bid, and then you score those bids and proceed with award or not, depending on what the outcome is. It's quite simple, quite straightforward. That is our tried and tested open procedure. Now, you'll recall under the previous rules, we had the competitive dialogue, we had competitive procedure with negotiation, we had the restricted procedure, innovation partnerships, etc., etc. All those are replaced under the new rules. We have only got 2 competitive procedures. So we've got the open procedure, and you probably guessed from the name on the slide, we've got the new competitive flexible procedure, or the CFP, as I may refer to today at times. So what is the new competitive flexible procedure? Well, let's look in the Procurement Act. Section 20 of the Procurement Act 2022B, to be specific, says such other competitive tendering procedure as the contracting authority considers appropriate for the purposes of awarding the public contract. Now, we'll delve into this in a little more detail in today's session. I think just the initial thing I would flag is quite a lot of discretion there, in my opinion. as the contracting authority considers appropriate. So ultimately, the ball is in your court. Yes, by all means, you can talk to the market, but ultimately it's your decision as to what you consider appropriate. But again, it must be appropriate. And as we'll see on the next slide, there are also rules about proportionality. There is guidance. You probably guessed that. There's something like 50 different guidance documents under the Procurement Act. If anybody suffers with insomnia, there's lots to keep you in reading material. But this is probably one of the more helpful guidance documents, I would say, simply because, some of the things we're looking at today, certainly from my perspective, they are, a bit more complex, a bit more new. So you may need a little more guidance than things which exist on the previous regime, for which I'm sure there's also a guidance note. But yeah, you will get a copy of the slides. I'm going to send that to Lorna after the session, and they will kindly arrange for that to be circulated. And that is one of those clicky links that will take you through to the competitive tendering procedures is the name of the guidance. So if you're looking for it, it's not competitive flexible procedure, it's competitive tendering procedures. I think there's probably some stuff in there about the open procedure as well. Anybody who's attended any of our previous sessions may recall that there is no overarching duty of proportionality under the Procurement Act. What do I mean by that? Those of you who were familiar with procuring under the previous regime will recall there was a principle and regulation 18 of the Public Contracts Regulations 2015 around proportionality. Now, that did not make its way across into the new rules. But, and there is a but, it does apply in the context specifically of competitive flexible procedure, as we're looking at in today's session. So again, section 23 of the Procurement Act tells us this. What does it say? It says a contracting authority must ensure mandatory that the procedure is a proportionate means of awarding the public contract, having regard to the nature, complexity, and cost of the contract. And we'll come back to in a moment what I think that means in simple terms. What does the guidance say? Again, it's the guidance on competitive tendering procedures. Accordingly, the procurement procedure should not be overly burdensome. Your procurement folks shouldn't be overly burdensome. Unnecessarily complex and or time-consuming procedures are also potential barriers that could deter SMEs and other suppliers from participating. So remember, we have our new duty in the Procurement Act to have regard to the existence of SME barriers and to consider whether those barriers can be removed or reduced. So getting back there to section 23, it must be proportionate to the nature, complexity, and cost of the contract. In simple terms, folks, if you are procuring a 500k contract, don't make it a 10-stage procurement process that takes a year. Just do try and marry up the complexity of your process with, the value and profile of the specific contract. And do remember, this is all going to be quite time consuming, particularly for SMEs. They may not be aware of how the process is going to work. So as we'll come on to later, aside from making it overly complicated, there are also other practical steps I would encourage you to take when using the competitive flexible procedure. In terms of some of the patterns so far, there are some conflicting data, which isn't terribly helpful regarding the use of the competitive flexible procedure. Hustle, the organisation you may be aware of, who publish data about public contracts and transparency, they suggest that I think it was certainly less than 10% of procurements were using the competitive flexible procedure. The Cabinet Office are saying it's closer to 20% or 25%. I don't know, but either way, I'm guessing it's in that sort of ballpark. But as we'll come on to, given that includes what would have been a restricted procedure, it's not a massively high percentage so far, at least. But I do think over time we are increasingly seeing authorities being prepared to launch their first competitive flexible procedures. But anyway, that is the rules in terms of, and remember, keep that word in your head rather when you're designing your competitive flexible procedure. Proportionality. Is this proportionate? Are we making it overly burdensome or unnecessarily complex? So, as I said, there is guidance there. What I've done to just summarize what I think are some of the key elements of that guidance is I've picked out a few specific themes. So the first theme is there is quite a lot of freedom, as I mentioned, in terms of how we run and design our competitive flexible procedure. What does the guidance say? The competitive flexible procedure replaces many of the more prescriptive procedures. It provides contracting authorities, i.e. yourselves on the call, with more opportunity and flexibility to design their own competitive tendering procedure. You can design a procedure similar to one of the procedures in the previous legislation if helpful. So, for example, nothing to stop you running what would have been a restricted procedure and just calling it the CFP. Or the guide says you can tailor one of those procedures as you consider appropriate. So you could have the restricted procedure, but add on a round of negotiation, or you could design your own procedure entirely. Exciting, terrifying, depending on your view on these things. But anyway, yeah, so again, long story short, folks, you do have lots of freedom here, lots of flexibility. And as we'll look at today, I think we also just have to be careful how we manage that, bearing in mind our legal duties that we've just looked at around, proportionality, etc., etc. And again, that's only guidance on competitive tendering procedures. What's our second theme? Transparency. It hasn't gone away. In designing and carrying out their procedure, contracting authorities must have regard to the procurement objectives in Section 12. So just to recap, folks, Section 12 is basically the new Regulation 18. Section 12, our objectives are, value for money, maximizing public benefit, sharing information, acting and being seen to act with integrity, etc., etc. And these are things that we must have regard to the importance of. So, we've covered in previous sessions, we really need to be considering these matters, documenting them. I'd like to see an audit trail in terms of your internal decision making, your strategy reports, your approvals. I think it's really important that you can cover on a practical level, why is this procurement delivering value for money? How are we maximizing public benefit? Are we acting with integrity, etc., etc.? So yes, in designing and carrying out the procedure, you do have to have regard to those procurement objectives in Section 12 and meet the procedural requirements, such as those relating to transparency. Section 12 of the Act, as we've just touched upon, requires that contracting authorities must have regard to the importance of sharing information for the purpose of allowing suppliers and others to understand the authority's procurement policies and decisions. I'm always going to shorten that one and just call it the sharing information principle. This is particularly relevant during the carrying out of a competitive flexible procedure. I think that's really important, folks. This is particularly relevant in the CFP because obviously we're doing something slightly different. We've maybe designed our own process. Bidders aren't familiar with it. We have to tell the market, we have to explain to them, this is how it's going to work. These are the stages. These are how those stages are going to be scored or used to eliminate bidders, etc., etc. So really, really important, that theme of transparency. Don't be confused by the fact that, like proportionality, we don't have a Regulation 18 equivalent principle of transparency in the Procurement Act. There is transparency right through the Act. I'm sure those of you in frontline procurement rules will be aware of all the new notices. So yeah, transparency certainly hasn't gone away. And finally then, on that note, the guidance also says the contracting authority must set out in the tender notice how the competitive flexible procedure is to be carried out. So in order to do that, you also have to know within your council, within your housing association, whichever type of contracting authority you are, you need to know, right, how are we going to run this process? Because if you don't know yourself, you're not going to be able to commit that to words in terms of articulating to the market with sufficient clarity, this is our process, this is what it's going to look like. And obviously, if you can't do that, you're in potentially hot water legally. Again, that's all taken from the guidance on competitive tendering procedures I mentioned earlier. What stages might our CFP, competitive flexible procedure, contain then? Well, as I touched upon, there's absolutely nothing to stop you running a two-stage procedure like the old restricted procedure. So that would be where, for instance, you have a selection stage where you filter bidders. Say, for instance, you could say, right, they need to have a particular minimum turnover or particular insurance requirements. They need to go and get those requirements if they win, etc., etc. So again, in this context, you're looking at the organization, their experience, financial ability, etc., etc. That could be your first round, and then those that get through could bid. So something akin to the old restricted procedure, or go absolutely wild. You can do something entirely more fancy. I've set out on the next slide a presentation the Cabinet Office delivered maybe last year, I think last year, year before. They all roll into one, don't they? Anyway, This is again, this is purely indicative, folks. It's not an official document, but hopefully just provides a flavor of the sort of things we could do. So these are tools or processes you could use in a competitive flexible procedure. So this slide gives examples of some tools or processes that may be used. It's not an exhaustive list. There are more that you could use based on your specific circumstances. So as you can see there, we've got things like negotiation, and we're going to come on to negotiation in a minute. Product demonstrations or prototype delivery, supplier engagement event. Now, note the supplier engagement event, that would be separate to pre-market engagement, because obviously at this point we are in process. It's not a preparatory step. You could also have supplier presentations. Again, we'll look at those in a moment in terms of what are the benefits, what are some of the legal risks, potential pitfalls. Final tenders, that could be where you say, right, best and final offers by X date, particularly if you've had a round of negotiation or dialogue. Audits and checks, site visits, dialogue, and again, we'll come on to dialogue in a moment. And the question I always ask in my head is, what's the difference between negotiation and dialogues? I'll try and answer that here today. I think intermediate assessment of tenders, that might be where you undertake an initial assessment and then you give people some feedback, or you enter into negotiation with them ahead of a later final tender or best and final offer, etc., etc. Or lastly, options. So again, lots of different things you could do, and this is by no means a definitive list. What might it look like in practice? We've also got some clues from the guidance that I touched upon. So number one there, A, including post-tender negotiations following a round of open tendering where all suppliers are invited to submit a tender. So again, then you could just say, right, but like the open procedure, anybody can bid. We're not having a filter stage in terms of, making sure people are, particular financial turnover, etc., etc. So just say, right, anybody can bid, and then entering into post-tender negotiations with those bidders. And again, we're going to look at negotiation in a little bit more detail, including post-tender negotiations following a round of selective tendering where shortlisted suppliers are invited to submit a tender. So that would, rather than open tendering, that would be selective tendering, where you've got some sort of filter in terms of, people need to achieve particular conditions of participation, that selection criteria, or they have to achieve particular requirements, maybe a particular score to get through to the next round. So you could have post-tender negotiations after what was akin to an open procedure, or you could have some sort of filtering round so that you are only negotiating with shortlisted suppliers. We'll come on to later what might be the pros and cons of that in terms of, for example, the number of bidders in the market. Obviously, if you have a densely populated market, you're probably not going to want to run a round of open tendering and then negotiate with 20 or 30 different bidders. So you do need to take care, and I think it's really, really important that you do your homework, do your pre-market engagement, do your research before embarking on the CFP. We'll come back to that later. What about option C then? Including multi-stage negotiations after an initial round of tendering. So you're having not just one negotiation stage, but numerous different negotiation stages. Or then D is building in the stage where there's a physical inspection or demonstration of the product, technology, or software to be supplied, such as a site visit or requiring suppliers to deliver a pilot. I did see an interesting competitive flexible procedure advertised recently. Someone on LinkedIn had posted a link to it, and what it was one of those ones which I think in principle is a good way to use the competitive flexible procedure. The authority goes to the market and says, we've got this problem, we're not quite sure how to fix it. You're the experts, you're the suppliers in this field, tell us how to fix it. And what they were doing was they were running like different pilot schemes with multiple bidders. But yeah, the thing I thought was interesting, I don't know, perhaps as a standard, is the suppliers weren't actually being paid to deliver the pilot. Now, the other thing I noticed is they haven't really done much pre-market engagement from the look of their notice. So as a supplier, are you going to want to deliver a pilot for free? I don't know. Maybe if the end prize is so lucrative and so fantastic, you sort of think, yeah, the juice is going to be worth the squeeze. But again, I think these are the things we need to be thinking about. These are the sort of things we need to be talking to the market about in terms of how would that operate. I'm not convinced every supplier is going to relish the opportunity to work for free, but Again, maybe if the end contract was going to be such a breakthrough for that company, et cetera, they might be minded to. But this is why, again, we need to be really, really careful on how we design this and make sure that we don't set the bar too high. We don't overcomplicate things. We don't design a process that just isn't attractive to our market. So yeah, I think pre-market engagement, as we looked at actually in our previous session with EN Procure, is really, really important. But I think particularly so folks in the context of this competitive flexible procedure, where you're doing something, as I said, a bit fancy, like you're having, pilots or, come on to later is like, proof of concept or feasibility studies, things like this. I think it's really important to engage with the market as to what that's going to look like. But again, those are some examples and they are by no means exhaustive. So what I've set out on this slide is these are diagrams taken from, you guessed it, the guidance. I'm not going to go through these in massive detail, folks. What again, you will, Emma and Lorna will kindly make sure everybody gets a copy of the slides. These are just taken from the guidance, and there are some indicative examples of what your multi-stage competitive flexible procedure would look like. Again, that comes with the caveat, it doesn't need to look like this. It could look like this, or you could change this, you could tweak it, you could add things, you could take things out. What I would just say though is these multi-stage competitive flexible procedures that are set out in the guidance are probably going to be more likely to be used because they are there. People can see them. Authorities can have a look at them and think, yeah, actually, we'll do something like that. That does have the benefit in terms of over time, they may be more standard. Now, again, there isn't really a standard with the competitive flexible procedure. It's not like the open procedure. With the CFP, you can do whatever you want within the legal parameters. But if you're using one of these ones in the guidance or something that's akin to that, I think that's potentially helpful. Obviously, if it fits your need and your objectives, because bidders may become over a period of time more acquainted with these types of procedures that are set out in the guidance. So there's a lot going on here. As I say, I'm not going to go through it word by word. But right over in the left-hand side there, actually sort of upside down sideways, we've got our preliminary market engagement. And again, I really would just stress it's going to be really, really important that you do your pre-market engagement when you're designing your competitive flexible procedure, because you're still going to have bidders who, when they bid, when you're running your first CFP, might also be their first competitive flexible procedure. Keep in mind, they won't have attended the cabinet office training or the deep dives or a lot of the, free webinars and things that, like we're here today, lots of resources for contracting authorities, not so much resources for bidders. So again, really, really important that you talk to the market. What you would have here then is an initial participation stage. Again, you maybe look at what would have been selection criteria in old money, conditions of participation in new money, as we looked at last time around. You would then, for example, look at bidders, no financial turnover. Are they going to get the insurance they need to have if they don't have it already? And as we see there, any other objective criteria set to limit suppliers. So if you're going to limit the number of suppliers, you need to have objective criteria. Again, needs to be very clearly set out. And then you would have to tell informed suppliers not invited to participate further. Anybody who didn't get through, you would have to essentially kick them out. For those who did, you would then move on to our second box, evaluation, and we'll be looking at evaluation in more detail later. Invite those shortlisted to submit an initial tender. You would then undertake an intermediate assessment, so not a final assessment. It would be like an initial sort of perhaps draft scores. And then you would invite those suppliers to negotiate, and you would carry out negotiating with them. And what would happen then is our third and final, the bigger dark green box there is award. You would, as I say, there's lots going on there, but I think long story short, you would invite them to bid their final tender, or sometimes also, best and final offers, whatever we want to call it. And then the remaining steps are just the same as for any other contract in terms of evaluation, publishing the notices, assessment summaries, etc., etc. So probably not really following their own advice there. I think that the diagram perhaps makes that look more complicated than it actually is, but it is a helpful indication of what a potential CFP might look like. There is another one. There's a few on these slides. as I say, you will get a copy. So this one is for you're having competitive flexible procedure with dialogue and or negotiation to further develop the requirement. And if we see there at the negotiation and dialogue stage, again in the middle, we see there further develop the draft contract and requirement. So something like this might be quite helpful where it's a complex contract and you're not necessarily using your own kind of authority standard terms and conditions, but also maybe you don't quite know what you need. As I say, sometimes a good example I think of using the CFP is we've got this problem, we don't know how to fix it, and then you're letting the market guide you towards a solution. A good example I seen of this was, I'm not actually sure if this was conducted under the competitive flexible procedure, but it was cited. I think it was under the previous rules, but there was, I think it might have been a London borough, and they had a real problem with traffic congestion in one part of the borough. So what they went out to the market and says is like, tell us how to solve this issue. So obviously different bidders had different suggestions as to how you would reduce and manage traffic. And because of that, then it was quite a lot of negotiation, dialogue. I think there was also, that might have been one where there was no different sort of pilot schemes in terms of let's try this on a small scale. Does it work? If it does, we can expand it. If it doesn't, sack it off and do something different. So again, I think that sometimes those kind of scenarios, again, where you've got a problem, but you're not quite sure of the solution, can be more akin to being effective use of the CFP. Whereas if you're just procuring something that you procure over and over again, fairly standard requirement, we probably don't need to get into the potential complexity or over complexity of a CFP. Anyway, so yes, in this one, then we are further developing the draft contract and the requirement. And then we are again in the final box there, the dark green box, we are moving through to, again, best and final offers stage. There's lots going on in this one. Again, this looks extremely complicated, but definitely need your caffeine before you embark on this one. Anyway, I'll pick out a few key elements. So this one is a competitive flexible procedure when tendering for innovation or product development. So just thinking aloud, there's also obviously a lot of talk at the moment artificial intelligence. There's a lot of talk about contracting authorities actually buying AI products to make their life easier, manage their resources more effectively, etc., etc. So this is quite an interesting one. So we've got here, if we look second from the top there, we've got a research and design phase, we've got prototype and development phase, we've got demonstration phase, we've got invent, proof of concept. Proof of concept is it's essentially, you're looking at a very early stage of the feasibility. Is it going to be feasible to do it in this way? If so, you move on then to developing the product, you test and validate, and then you also demonstrate. So in terms of, demonstrations, presentations, whatever we want to call it, I do think these are the scenarios where it may be useful to have that demonstration phase to see that, to the users in the room, the end users, and have a look at, what exactly is this AI tool or whatever innovation or product that we're buying, how's it going to work, what's its functionality, etc., etc. And again, there we see in the middle box, we are further developing the draft contract and requirements. It's not like a traditional open procedure where we just publish our contract and say, like it or lump it, take it or leave it. So there is that is being developed as we go along, as we kind of let the market design the solution. So again, this isn't going to be used for everything. It's there is a bit of complexity there. As I say, though, the final box in dark green, a lot of that is just the notices. So, in terms of the actual CFP, that's going to be the same notices as you need for an open procedure. So, I think the diagram is very busy, but when you break these down, there's maybe just not as much going on as it seems at first glance. But again, that this is particularly potentially rather indicative model if you are, procuring something that again doesn't exist. You just know your council or housing association has a problem, you've got a difficulty, and you go out to the market and you want them to help you out. Again, though, cannot emphasize enough, your pre-market engagement is really, really, really important. particularly in these ones when you are doing something a bit more complex, and a little more out of people's comfort zone in terms of how they usually procure. But there are certainly, as we'll come on to, potential benefits for these types of more complex needs for your authority. And that one then, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. Again, you will get a copy of the slides. This is just a competitive flexible procedure where there isn't a separate participation stage. So again, a bit like the open procedure, anybody can bid. You're not filtering or limiting the number of people who can bid. If everybody could just double check you're on mute, please, folks. Thank you. So what stages might our competitive flexible procedure actually contain? We've touched upon one there, which in my experience is quite popular with people, and that is presentations. Presentations, in my experience, clients tend to like them. They like the idea of it, but they haven't necessarily always thought through, again, just in my experience, of how it is going to operate. Therefore, traditionally, I think us lawyers and public procurement professionals have been a little bit nervous about the use of presentations. I think there are certainly risk of, lack of transparency, risk of bias, risk of it being overly subjective, etc., etc. I know what you're thinking, Kieran, you're just being a risk-adverse lawyer, but we do have some examples from the case law, so, it's not all in my head, these concerns. There was the Consultant Connect case a number of years ago. That was a successful legal challenge to an NHS procurement. Some of you may be familiar with that case. I think we've probably touched upon it in one or two of the other sessions. Really good example of how not to run a procurement. There was all sorts of shenanigans going on. I'll come on to in a moment what the issue was in terms of presentations. But there was also a provider selection regime case earlier this year involving Liverpool University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust and their procurement for an urgent care service. And again, issues in that case regarding the use of presentations. Anybody who's not aware, the provider selection regime is a kind of parallel procurement regime for certain healthcare services. Primarily affects the NHS, does also impact local authorities. So, for example, if a council was procuring a sexual health service, sexual prevention, that would be under the provider selection regime. And there are a few other kind of random categories of spend within a local authority that would fall within the provider selection regime. But as I said, it's not the Procurement Act, but there is some overlap in terms of the general principles. And what happens in the provider selection regime is if someone's not happy, they can complain to a panel. The panel issues advice, which is non-binding, but I think, sensibly the authorities usually follow the advice. So anyway, what happened in those cases? The bidders were unaware they were being scored. Not a good start, folks. It's not rocket science in terms of, can you imagine you were going for a job interview and someone said, can you deliver a presentation, but it's not scored? And then later they said, oh, you didn't get the job because your presentation wasn't very good. True story. That's not going to be very fair. So likewise, in the public procurement context, bidders need to know they are being scored. So in that PSR case, the NHS Trust, the panel said, we did not see a methodology for how the presentations would be used to inform the scoring in a consistent way. No methodology. Again, not a good start. The lack of any notes from the presentations and not retaining copies reinforces these concerns, which will take me very nicely onto our third and final theme today, folks, when we come to look at record keeping. Lack of notes and not retaining copies of the presentations reinforces these concerns. So, how can we reduce the risks then? As I say, I do think you need to think very carefully if a presentation is needed in the first place. But if your stakeholders are absolutely adamant, Kieran, we want a presentation, we're so keen on one. You do need to be clear. Why do you need a presentation? What is the purpose of the presentation? Is it to aid the written response? Is it going to be scored completely separately? Clearly articulate that purpose to all bidders. So again, make sure bidders know in your ITT, your invitation to tender, what is the purpose of the presentation. Is it being scored in conjunction with their written bid? Is it something separate? If so, what's the available scores? What's the weightings? What's the scoring matrix, etc.? Tell bidders it will affect the scores. It seems a nonsense to suggest it won't. See, for example, those cases I mentioned on the previous slide. I have people said I've heard people in the past say to me, "Oh, Kieran, we're going to have a presentation stage, but it's just for information purposes." And I'm like, really? Are you telling me if someone comes in and delivers the worst presentation you've ever seen, you're just going to be like, oh yeah, it's fine, we'll crack on with them. Of course you're not. So, cut the nonsense. Of course, it's going to impact the scoring. So what you need to do there is then therefore design the process that way. What are the scores? What are the available scores? Again, is it being scored on its own? Is it being scored in conjunction with a written bid, etc., etc.? But again, I see this nonsense. Oh, it's just for information purposes. Of course, it's not. Come on, be realistic. Have a scoring matrix for the presentation and disclose it to bidders, just like you would for a paper evaluation. And we'll come on to written evaluations in part 2 of our webinar today. Follow the rules on award criteria, section 23 of the Act. So remember, for example, that the award criteria must be linked to the subject matter of the contract. So you need to be, if you're asking them to present on something, you shouldn't really be asking them to present on just what their organization does. It needs to be linked to the subject matter of the contracts. It needs to be something that can be tied in with the specific procurement you're running. And also then there are other rules on award criteria in general around making sure that they are clear, etc. Train your evaluators. We'll look at that later. But again, really, really important. Make sure they're trained just like they would be trained for a written evaluation exercise. Consider how you will maintain same treatment. That is the artist formerly known as equal treatment under PCR. So for example, on a practical level, are you going to give bidders the same time slot? Are you going to, or I'm looking at presentations here, but if, for example, you were applying this to site visits, are you having a site visit of the same duration for each bidder, etc., etc. Take notes and keep copies of the presentations. Again, that was a criticism of the panel in the PSR case from earlier in the year. But again, do approach with caution in the first place. Do you really need to have a presentation? In my experience, the answer is often not, particularly once you start to explain all of this to people and, it's adding more complexity and, it needs to be objective, not just, oh yeah, we like the sound of these guys or, we get on well with them on an interpersonal level. Well, how do you translate that into objective scoring? So do just think carefully about presentations in the first place. But if you are going to do them, as I say, I think there are ways to manage it and reduce the risks as set out on the slides there, keeping in mind some of the lessons from those previous cases. Moving on then to dialogue and negotiation. That was one of the potential stages that we've seen earlier. So as I say, a few people have asked me over the years, what's the difference between dialogue and negotiations? At which point I have smiled and thought to myself, I don't actually know when I start to think about that. But I do know now, sort of. I think the guidance has told me, hopefully. Anyway, dialogue refers to the discussion between the contracting authority and suppliers about any aspect of the procurement. Negotiation, on the other hand, is discussion between the contracting authority and the supplier with a view to improving the content of tenders. On a practical level, what does this mean? So I would take it to be then, I'll give you an example. You are having a dialogue stage with the bidder during this wonderful, fancy, competitive, flexible procedure that you've designed off the back of today's session. And the bidder says to you, look, these KPIs are rubbish. They are unachievable. We're really concerned about the future contract performance notices ranking our performance. That's dialogue. It's a discussion between the contracting authority and the suppliers about any aspect of the procurement. What about negotiation? I would take that to be then rather you get a bid in from a supplier and you maybe say to them, right, for your social value offering, you've promised A, B, and C. Could you possibly offer D as well if we were to make this tweak? Or, in terms of your unit price, could you potentially reduce that or improve that? So again, it's specific. It's still dialogue, but it's specifically with a view to improving the content of tenders. So it seems to be the kind of quite subtle distinction between dialogue and negotiation. But I think it can be probably quite a thin and fine line at times as to when does dialogue stray into negotiation. But it's worth being clear in your head what it is you want. The other thing I would say is, in terms of dialogue, you can do an awful lot of dialogue pre-market engagement stage. And as we looked at last time around, that's sometimes a good time to do it because you're not in the heat of, the actual procurement with all the, the more rigid rules around, timescales, award criteria, the ability to make changes, as we'll come on to. So, if it's dialogue you're after, then, do also, bring that forward to the extent possible and do that as part of your pre-market engagement. Not going to go into it in massive detail today, folks. There is some helpful further reading on both dialogue and negotiations in these documents. The one on the left-hand side is something called the Sourcing Playbook. It's a government publication. Goes into a lot of detail about service delivery and public procurement, etc. There's also a guidance note for competitive dialogue and competitive procedure with negotiation. Obviously, as I mentioned, we don't have those anymore, but like we seen earlier, we can design our competitive flexible procedure based on things that exist under the previous regime. So there's absolutely nothing to stop you going back and looking at your competitive procedure with negotiation guidance note there, which has got some helpful guidance points regarding dialogue and negotiations. Again, Lorna and the team will very kindly ensure you get a copy of the slides post-event. What are some practical points we should consider then when we are deciding whether or not we want to negotiate or have dialogue? Do we need to talk to the market during the process? Again, can we bring that forward and do it at the pre-market engagement stage where there's, less hard and fast legal rules? Have we identified areas that would benefit from negotiation and dialogue? Again, I would want to have a clear purpose. What's the point of the negotiation or dialogue? And we don't want to just be, again, looking back to earlier, overcomplicating things unnecessarily. What is and isn't up for negotiation? Do we have any red lines? If so, are we making that clear? Do we have the capacity and capability? I think you have to have a really honest conversation with yourself, folks, in terms of this. You will need a strong chair if you're negotiating and to be supported with a team with defined roles, responsibilities, skills, experience. So maybe have that, and that's fine. If you want to do this, then maybe think, can we bring that in? Can we get support with that? I know, for example, under the competitive dialogue, often it would be a contracting authority would even bring in a law firm to help kind of project manage and run the procurement with them, or indeed consultants from a procurement background, etc., etc. But again, do just have an honest conversation about that, because if you are a small team, you've maybe had a bit of turnover, you've got a few vacant positions at the moment, maybe particularly short on senior experience, do just think, right, is this actually a good idea for us to be embarking on something that's quite complex, resource intensive, etc., etc. What is your strategy? What is your plan to achieve the desired outcome? Again, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. As I always say, very true in many facets of public procurement, but do make sure you're sitting down, you design your strategy, right, this is our plan, make sure everybody knows that plan. So again, lots of preparation needed. Do you have a pre-agreed negotiation position? Again, are there any particular red lines, things that you will not cross? Do you have an appropriate and clear timetable? This is going to be really important, folks. I know procurement people, I feel your pain when someone comes to you and says, right, I need help with this procurement. All right, when do we need it by? Oh, actually, the contract expires next week. Great, thanks for that. So yes, if people are, joking aside, if people are going to embark upon a CFP, they need to be coming to you early, folks, so you can guide them through all of these points. You can design the process. You can do that all important pre-market engagement. So you also then have to have an appropriate and clear timetable for the procurement itself. Realistically, if you don't have more time than you usually do, it's going to be a non-runner. Although you can also look at things like, can you extend previous contracts, which, just remember, would be a case of looking at Regulation 72, because existing contracts will continue to be governed by the previous regime. But that can sometimes be a good way to buy yourself more time. If people's hearts are set on a competitive flexible procedure and you just don't have the time, can look at whether it's feasible, possible, compliant to extend an existing incumbent. How are you going to project manage effectively to avoid time and cost overruns? So by that, I mean the actual procurement time and cost, rather than the actual contract time and cost, which will obviously then become a contract management issue in due course. Does our tender notice and our invitation to tender clearly describe the dialogue and negotiation process? I think, again, folks, it's really, really important that you capture that detail. How will we ensure same/equal treatment of bidders? Again, that's not always easy to maintain that even playing field when you're perhaps negotiating with lots of different bidders at once. So you might also want to consider then, can we filter down the number of bidders that we're going to negotiate or have enter into dialogue with? What about modifying a procurement under the new rules then? Well, as I've set out on the slide there, under the open procedure, I'm conscious we're not looking at the open procedure, but I'll just come back to in a moment why this is relevant. So you can make any modifications to the procurement subject to compliance with the other elements of the Act, but you must consider revising the deadlines and time limits, and you must republish or provide again the tender notice and the tender documents. So if, for example, you realise actually we need to add something to the specification or make quite a significant change, you can do that, but you need to consider revising the deadlines and time limits, and you need to republish again the tender notice and the relevant documents that you've changed. The position is the same for the competitive flexible procedure right up until the first deadline. What do I mean by that? If, for example, you have a deadline to participate, where you say to bidders, right, if you're interested in participating in a competitive flexible procedure, this is your deadline. Right up until that deadline, the rules are the same as the open procedure. Once that deadline has passed, so you're over the first sort of hurdle of your CFP, you can only make changes which are non-substantial. Apart from light touch contracts, separate rules on that. But again, you must then consider revising the deadlines and the time limits, and you must notify participating suppliers. So only changes which are not substantial, because obviously you are then in the process. And the difficulty, I suppose, is if you make a change that is substantial, arguably a bidder who's already been kicked out or maybe filtered out of an earlier stage can come back and say, well, if you'd have made that change, well, we would have got through. So I think, long story short, I would try and get it tied down as much at the outset to avoid having to make these changes. Before you do make the changes, you do have a bit of flexibility. The amount of flexibility will depend on whether or not that that first deadline has passed, because we're into what I would describe as an in progress CFP in terms of we're past that initial deadline. You then can only make changes which are not substantial. What about refining award criteria? This is another new concept which appears in the Procurement Act, Section 24 to be precise. This is only permitted under the competitive flexible procedure, so we cannot do this under the open procedure. It's only allowed for two conditions are satisfied. The first condition, your tender notice or tender documents must provide that it may happen. So you'd want to set that out clearly. We reserve the right to award, or we reserve the right to refine our award criteria, set out some details. And you haven't yet invited bidders to submit tenders to be assessed under Section 19. So you can't yet have invited bidders to submit their tenders. The refinement is not permitted if it would have allowed progression of suppliers who did not already progress at an earlier round. So again, if someone's been kicked out essentially, and the change you're making would actually allow them to still be in because they might have scored well on the thing they didn't score well of, etc., etc. You cannot make that change. The refinement is not permitted if it would allow the progression of suppliers who would already have been kicked out. Further refinement happens, you need to modify and republish the tender notice and any tender documents affected. What constitutes a refinement? It's a good question. It's not defined in the Act, but the guidance does say it could include, for example, adding additional detail to existing criteria, adding related sub-criteria to existing criteria, or amending criteria weightings within a published range. Adding new award criteria would not be permissible under Section 24. So let's break that down. So for example, if you had, you said, right, we are going to have 10% for social value, and you don't have much detail beyond that, you could refine that. You could add more detail in terms of, as you go through, you could potentially say, right, there's going to be 5% on sustainability, there's going to be 5% on jobs or economic growth, whatever it might be. What you couldn't do is publish a tender and say it's 90% quality, 10% price. And then during the CFP, say, actually, we're adding 10% social value on top of that, because, again, adding new award criteria isn't permissible. But what you can do is you can kind of supplement or refine your existing criteria. And another thing then you could do is, looking at that, then you would also be prudent to consider whether you want to reserve the right to change the actual evaluation questions, What I would just say with this is, again, folks, I think there's a risk here of overcomplicating things, which regular attendees will know I'm not a fan of. So I wouldn't get into this unless you need to, unless you think actually there is a reason why we need to refine award criteria, because obviously it's also going to make your tender documents longer if you're having to put in stuff like this, and also your notice, if you're going to have to explain when you're going to do stuff like this. It's making your documents longer, and also creating a potential pitfall if you don't follow those things. I would just think very carefully, do we need this in the first place? But if you do, there is that flexibility. What templates are available to help you navigate this bold new world? There is a template document which describes how the procurement will be conducted. It can be found on the Procurement Pathway website. And again, that's a clickable link. There's also accompanying guidance for the above template. What I would just say, folks, I've seen some authorities, I'll post a rant on LinkedIn about this at some point. I've seen some authorities use this document as an invitation to tender for an open procedure. I would caution against that. That's not what it's designed for, and I would suggest it doesn't cover everything you would want an open ITT to cover. So I think it's probably a good starting, probably a good starting point, but it's certainly not the end point. So do think very carefully. And there is a bit of work here in terms of pulling this together. One of the things that, hard to please, as you probably gathered. But one of the things I don't like about this is you've got the template and then the guidance is in a separate document. To me, it would have been better if you had the template and then the guidance underneath as kind of drafting notes. But essentially, yeah, it's there, but it's not going to be a quick task for anybody who's looked at pulling this together. What you might want to do over a period of time is look at putting together your own template at your housing association or council, or whichever type of authority you're here from today, and then look at supplementing that with internal guidance, training, etc., etc. But again, it's probably better than a blank page. So check that out. And you can also get a list of potential stages, including considerations and advantages on the list. It make me laugh. It's a bit of a whitewash in terms of it wasn't advantages and disadvantages, it was considerations and advantages. So yes, some of those considerations are disadvantages. There are also other disadvantages, as we've looked at today, and we'll come on to in a moment. So do just be aware of some of these things. There's a bit of government spin. I think they are quite keen to promote this competitive flexible procedure, which is fine. But again, do just be aware, certainly from my perspective and experience as a solicitor over the past decade or so, I think there are some potential issues as well. So do think carefully before embarking on one of these CFPs. On that note, I mentioned there are opportunities. I mentioned there are some possible risks. What are the opportunities? What could go right in our competitive flexible procedure? Well, you could let market experts guide you towards solving a problem you're not quite sure how to solve. So I think that's a good one. As I say, there was that example, I think it was a London borough. They just had a real traffic build up in one part of the borough. So it was, how do we sort that? There's probably different ways to crack that nut. Greater face time with the market during the procurement process. So that can be helpful, to discuss areas of concern, to understand what is on offer, to test your relationship with them, etc., etc. So that face time can be important. It can be beneficial. You can end up with a more bespoke outcome tailored to your authority's specific requirements, not just the kind of off the shelf, here's what we sell to everybody product. That may be particularly helpful for things like if you're buying some sort of artificial intelligence tool. And I think, as I say, we'll see more of that in the coming years. Greater innovation, again, new ideas, new products, new methods of delivery. That can certainly be a benefit, new ways of working. And where the contract is complex, both parties can agree terms they are comfortable with, rather than bidders pricing up or walking away due to risk for an open procedure contract, or seeking to make potentially unlawful modifications post-deadline where you run an open procedure. So it does help in a more complex contract to reach a kind of mutually agreed position, ideally. So that's what could go right. What could go wrong? Typical cynical lawyer. SMEs and others put off from bidding due to overcomplicated process. I think that's a risk. You do need to be aware of that. How are you going to manage that risk if you are running a CFP? Failure to adequately plan and then clearly describe the procedure in advance. So failure to plan and then describe the procedure in advance. So for me, in tandem with the next point from a legal perspective, that's probably my greatest area of concern in terms of risk. Those conducting the procedure don't follow the advertised process. In truth, how often are people going back and looking at the ITT and saying, what did, paragraph 312 say as to how we would do this? In my experience, not a massive amount. So just be aware there is that particular risk here in terms of, is the presentation, is the site visit, is the dialogue, is the negotiation being conducted in accordance with what the ITT said? Really need to ram that home to people, as we'll look at later in evaluation, but also true all throughout procurement. It's really, really important that you do what you said you were going to do. The authority underestimates the time and effort involved. And I'm sure you can probably see from some of the things we've looked at today, this could be a time and resource intensive process embarking on one of these CFPs, particularly if you've got lots of bidders and multiple stages. The process sounds good, but it just doesn't work well in practice. Again, I think there is a risk of that in terms of, this flexibility. It all sounds great. When you actually go to do it, you think, actually, this is really time consuming. We actually haven't really thought through in advance how we would deal with this particular scenario, etc., etc. It can be increasingly difficult to maintain the even playing field of same treatment or equal treatment when speaking to different bidders simultaneously. So is there a potential risk you're end up telling one bidder more information than you're giving to their competitor, etc., etc.? You do just think, how can we manage and mitigate those risks? So what are some indicative factors I would encourage you to be thinking about in terms of using the open or using the CFP? So I've set out on the left-hand side, folks, some indicative factors for an open procedure. I've set out some indicative factors on the right-hand side for a competitive procedure. What I would say, typical lawyers caveat at the bottom, is it's likely most procurements will involve some factors from both lists. So you could, for example, have an open procedure for a high value procurement if that was considered appropriate. So look at suitability and from an overall perspective. So on the left-hand side there, open procedure, straightforward requirement. Maybe your council, your housing association has procured this loads of times. Lower value, again, maybe just creeping over a threshold, 500K, 1 million, something like that. Smaller number of bidders. You don't feel any need to filter down the number of bids. You're happy, you'll maybe get 5 bids, 6 bids, whatever it might be. Limited time available. Again, stakeholders have maybe come to you late in the day. I'm sure that never happens at your authority. And now small budget. By that I mean budget for the procurement rather than the actual contract itself. So again, you just don't necessarily have the resources to bring in external support or internal resource. Again, no limited internal capacity and capability. You don't really have many people available who are comfortable and confident with running these kind of procedures. You don't have lots of staff with experience of, competitive dialogue, competitive procedure with negotiation, etc., etc. You're using your standard contract terms. There's nothing particularly sophisticated or unusual, and you've minimal legal support available. What about the competitive flexible procedure then? When might your eyes light up and think, yes, aha, this is it. This is our big opportunity to use our first CFP. So it's a more complex requirement. Again, it may be the requirement is actually that you have a problem and you don't yet know what the solution is to that requirement and you want the market to guide you. It's a higher value. Again, it may then be more worthwhile in terms of the investment and time from both bidders and the authority. You've got a larger number of bidders. So, for example, you might want some sort of stage to filter that down. You've got significant time available. Yeah, that would be nice. I haven't had that one before. Anyway, you've got a higher budget to run the procurement. Again, you'll maybe have a bit of resource to bring in external support for certain elements. Higher level of internal capacity and capability. You've got a well-stocked procurement and commercial team, and you've got some, experience. It's going to be really helpful here in terms of negotiation, etc. It's a more complex contractual structure, so it wouldn't be appropriate to use your standard contract terms, and you are going to need to develop a bespoke contract to account for the particular risks of the procurement as we go through. And legal support is available, whether that's internal support, external support, or if you're very, very lucky, both. So again, Every procurement will probably have bits from each list, but this is, I think, from my perspective, a helpful way to think, right, is this open or CFP? What's going to be most appropriate for us? Just to conclude then, before we take a short break, I think there are potentially, in my view, 5 steps to success for a competitive flexible procedure. So you heard it here first. What I always say to people is, remember, the competitive flexible procedure, it's DIY. It's design it yourself. It's not make it up as you go along, because you certainly will need to speak to a lawyer if that happens. So number 1, consider whether the competitive flexible procedure is appropriate in the first place. First things first, is this the best route to market for our authority? If not, then it goes no further than that. It may be actually we think, well, we're just going to use a framework or we're just going to run an open procedure. That's fine if that's going to be best for your authority. So step number 1, is this appropriate in the first place? And for some procurements, that will be the only one of the 5 steps that you embark upon. But step 2, then, we've decided, yes, it is appropriate. You then need to take time to carefully plan the process. If you don't know in your heads within the contracting authority what the process is going to look like, you've got no hope whatsoever of bidders knowing that. You've got no hope whatsoever of you being able to articulate that to bidders. So take time to carefully plan the process. How many stages, which stages, how's each stage going to operate, etc., etc. Number 3, then, tell the market what you're going to do. In your tender notice, in your tender documents, in your ITT in particular, explain to the market, this is what we're doing, this is the stages, this is how each stage is going to operate. Number 4, do it, and do it the way you've said you will do it. Again, really, really important in public procurement to follow the course that you follow, the path that you have set yourself. And then number 5, be able to evidence you've done it that way. So tell the market you're going to do it the way you've said you do it, and then be able to evidence you've done it that way. And noting the new feedback and transparency obligations, for example, assessment summaries and the different notices that we have to publish in the tender process. So there you have it, folks. Those are my 5 steps to success for a competitive flexible procedure. I say there are 5 steps to success for a competitive flexible procedure. Steps 2 to 5, I think, are also a sensible approach for any procurement, really, even out with the CFP. So even you're running an open procedure, I think those are helpful principles to guide you and guide your authority towards a hopefully successful and hopefully compliant outcome. So I promised everybody we would have a 5-minute break, and I like to keep our promises. So let's have a 5-minute break, folks. If everybody could be back for just before 10 past, we will get cracking with the remainder of the session. See you in a moment. Thank you. Hello again, everybody. So let's get cracking with the remainder of the session. So in this second segment, folks, we're going to move on to look at bid evaluation. Really, really important topic in public procurement. Was really important under the previous rules. I think will remain incredibly important under our new Procurement Act. Why is that? Why is evaluation important? Why does evaluation matter? There are a number of reasons. I've picked out a few here. Valuation enables your authority, whether that's your council, your housing association, whichever type of contracting authority you're from. It enables you to identify the best bid and therefore, in principle, the best outcome for your authority. It's subject to certain legal rules, as we'll touch upon today. There are consequences for failure to comply with those rules. So procurement is not just a compliance exercise, but don't take your eye off the ball in terms of that compliance, folks. Not an area of headline change under the Procurement Act. So, we've looked at some of the headline changes in this series already, and we'll look at some more changes. So things like, the new competitive flexible procedure, open frameworks, etc. Evaluation isn't one of those headline changes, but as I said, it was really, really important under the previous rules, and I've seen absolutely nothing to suggest it won't continue being incredibly important under our new regime. The good news is, and we'll look at some of these, lots of practical things you can do to make life easier for yourself. Get the right questions, get the right scoring matrix, train your evaluators, lots of really important practical steps you can take just to help manage and mitigate the risks to your authority. And record keeping is really, really important too. And as I say, we'll look at, in our third segment today, we're going to look at record keeping, but particularly in the context of evaluation. Remember the new rules on debriefing, which we will come on to in terms of assessment summaries, replacing standstill letters or Alcatel letters if you really want to show your age. It's a very visible phase of the procurement process. What do I mean by that? Well, obviously, bidders put in their bids, you go off and score. That all happens behind closed doors. There can be weeks, certainly maybe even a few months where it all goes a bit quiet. Then all of a sudden bidders get that notification or that alert on the portal or whatever. You've got mail, and they then get their result. Now, we have to remember here, emotions are running high. If you are the person getting that letter, you're either going to be delighted or you're going to be despondent. So because emotions are high, legal risk is also high. Let me tell you, nobody will go and speak to a solicitor quicker than someone who's upset, someone who's peeved off about someone who feels they haven't been treated fairly, etc., etc. So we have to use our emotional intelligence to manage those risks. As I say, come on to some practical examples, but really it's about letting people down gently if they haven't been successful. But that legal risk is high because emotions are high. Why is the evaluation important? Another reason, if your evaluation isn't compliant, it's going to be very, very difficult to do a compliant assessment summary. So again, that's the new standstill letter that publicizes the fact to the market that your evaluation wasn't compliant. I always say to people, the public procurement process is like a chain. It's only going to be as strong as its weakest link. It's only going to be as strong as what's went before. So in order to have a robust feedback letter, it's absolutely imperative, folks, that you have a robust evaluation. Evaluation is the most commonly challenged area of the procurement process. What I mean by that is, your formal legal challenges in the courts, complaints about errors in scoring, undisclosed sub-criteria. That's where you've maybe scored a bidder down and said you didn't get full marks because you didn't cover A, B, and C. And they say, well, that's great. You didn't ask for A, B, and C in the question. The specification didn't mention A, B, and C, etc., etc. These kind of things, folks, are very fertile ground indeed for legal challenges. And I think it will remain that way. And any mistakes or issues in evaluation are very likely to all come out in the wash during a procurement challenge due to the obligation of disclosure. Typically in a legal case in this country, you have to disclose those things that help your case, but also those things that harm your case. So mistakes, issues, internal emails, unhelpful comments, etc., can all come out in the wash. Again, the good news is there's lots of practical steps we can take to manage the risks in this regard. So what's actually changed under the Procurement Act? As I said, evaluation is not an area of headline change. There are a few important changes that will impact to some extent your evaluation process. I'm going to run through those very quickly. So remember, every above threshold procurement, you must have a conflict assessment. Don't confuse this with the individual conflicts of interest declarations. The conflicts assessment is one conflicts assessment for the whole procurement. But what you need to do is make sure your evaluators are completing an individual conflicts declaration, and then make sure that is being recorded on your conflicts assessment. Who are the evaluators that they have returned their individual declarations, that there are no issues, or where there are issues that you have sought to mitigate and manage those issues. Next thing to be aware of, as we've touched upon, losing bidders will now receive the winning bidders feedback also. Not the winning bidders bid, but the winning bidders feedback. So they will get their own assessment summary. They will also get the winning bidders assessment summary. So as we'll see, I think there's potentially more for a losing bidder to pick at. Whereas in the past, they might have said, we were scored too low. They could potentially now also say, we were scored too low. The winning bidder was scored too high. So potentially a double-pronged attack. Scores must now be explained by reference to relevant information in the tender. And the guidance on assessment summaries gives a number of examples of this. So really focus on your moderation records need to now capture that detail. So, for example, you scored 10 out of 10 because in section 2 of your response, you set out lots of detail about A, B, and C. So again, you need to tie it back to relevant information in the tender. The guidance says you should also explain why the bidder didn't achieve the score above. It's not a legal requirement to tell them that, but it's recommended. So if, for example, someone scored 6 out of 10, the legal requirement would be to tell them they scored 6 out of 10, to give them reasons for that. The guidance would also be you should explain why they didn't score 8 out of 10. And this is intended to encourage bidders to improve for future. But just remember, that is guidance. It's not black letter law. That wasn't a change that was made during the consultation process over the past few years. There is no express principle imposing a duty of transparency. We looked at that earlier in terms of the competitive flexible procedure, unlike PCR 2015. But we do have that new objective we looked at earlier regarding sharing information, which you as a contracting authority must have regard to the importance of. And the guidance on assessing, the guidance on assessing competitive tenders under the Act states that the basis on which contracts are awarded is largely unchanged from the previous legislation in terms of what can be assessed when evaluating tenders. And I like this one, short and sweet, the process of awarding contracts must be transparent. Really, really important line there, folks. Really summarizes quite nicely what public procurement is all about in terms of legal rules. The process of awarding contracts must be transparent. So do just keep that in mind in terms of your evaluation processes and procedures. In practice, then, there's possibly not much change from the previous rules, apart from the bits I looked at in terms of conflicts assessment, assessment summaries, etc. But in terms of the actual evaluation itself, probably not an area of headline change. So, from my perspective, I think it would be eminently sensible to look at what are the lessons from the previous rules. How can we continue to apply those under the new regime? So what are some of the key principles from existing case law? Number one, the authority must follow the process it has set itself. Ties in very nicely with our first session on the competitive flexible procedure. Ultimately, folks, if your ITT says we're going to run the procurement this way, you then need to run your procurement that way. Evaluators have a margin of appreciation. What do I mean by this? Evaluators have a little bit of flexibility. Say the evaluation panel is Lorna and I. M thinks it's a 10, Lorna thinks it's an 8, I think it's a 6. That's fine. We've all got our margin of appreciation. We've got a bit of flexibility. Just because one person thinks it's a 10 and the other person thinks it's an 8 doesn't mean there's necessarily a problem. The courts will recognize the competence of evaluators as subject matter experts. They will be very reluctant to interfere in the scoring. They will only interfere in a subject matter expert scoring where there has been something called a manifest error. This is a term that comes up a lot in public procurement law. A manifest error, folks, is essentially a clear error, and it must also be one that impacted the outcome of the procurement. So, for example, someone was scored wrongly, and because they were scored wrongly, they didn't win when otherwise they would have won, etc., etc. What are some of the other key principles? Record keeping and reasons are very important. The authority must be able to explain its scores. And again, that will tie in very nicely with our final segment today on record keeping. Doesn't need to be verbatim. It doesn't need to be a blow-by-blow account of those evaluation and moderation meetings. Perfection is not required. Probably a good thing for a lot of procurements that have crossed my desk over the years. Anyway, just because a bidder is not happy doesn't mean there are grounds for a claim. So just because someone's writing in and saying, actually, this should have been 10 out of 10, it's not an 8 out of 10, that of itself is not a problem. That's their subjective view. The courts generally will defer to the subject matter experts, evaluators. So again, unless there's been some sort of legal issue or breach, just because the bidder thinks they scored higher, should have scored higher, doesn't mean you have any legal problem. So what I'm going to do in this segment, folks, slightly different to the last one. I am going to give you a list of do's and don'ts for evaluation, and then we will conclude with just some final thoughts as to what your role is as a procurement professional in that process. So we'll start on a positive note. We will look at the do's. Things you should do: appoint subject matter experts as evaluators. As we've seen, folks, the courts are more likely to defer to their knowledge and afford them that degree of deference and respect as a subject matter expert. And we see that, for example, in the Bechtel versus HS2 case. That was a case the contracting authority successfully defended, and the courts said that they would, in particular, cede to the views of subject matter experts, which tells me, don't bring in people to make up the numbers. It's evaluation that should be more about quality than quantity. In that case, I think there were either 2 or 3 evaluators, so it wasn't like a massive room full of people. But they were subject matter experts. So top tip number 1, appoint subject matter experts as evaluators. There isn't a legal definition of what a subject matter expert is. It's basically just folks, someone who knows the terrain. So to give you an example, I'm a solicitor. I previously worked in local government. A few years ago, I was an evaluator in a procurement process for a legal services framework being set up by a local government body. So no special particular qualification. It was just, I was working in that sector. I knew the terrain. I myself was a lawyer. I was instructing external law firms. So, that is essentially what it means. There's no special particular status needs to be afforded, but it just someone who knows the turf is a subject matter expert. Take care when drafting your evaluation questions. Focus on the bid, not the bidder. And some of you may have seen me ranting on LinkedIn about this a while back, about a question that said, for example, what does your organization do for social value? That's not linked to the subject matter of the contract. No, that could be stuff the organization does in a completely different country under completely different contracts. Make sure you're asking nice, tight, focused questions. Focus on the bid, not the bidder, and avoid long-winded questions which are difficult to respond to for bidders and they're difficult for your evaluators to score. So again, don't have a question that's got a bit about customer satisfaction, a bit about contract management, a bit about data protection, and a bit about innovation, because what if they score well on, or they answer the question well for 3 of those 4 elements, but they give you a really rubbish answer on 1? How are you going to score that? Particularly if you don't have sub-weightings, it very quickly becomes a bit of a mess. I would generally try to pick 1 theme per question. Ensure same treatment. Treat all bidders consistently. This is a cornerstone of public procurement law, and it seems set to remain as such under the new Procurement Act, where equal treatment is now same treatment. So for a practical level, if you're going back to 1 bidder with lots of clarifications, but you're not doing that to other bidders, you're probably not treating them the same. So try and maintain that consistent level playing field. Train your evaluators. This should have been number 1. Actually, I don't know what I'm doing. This should be the number 1. Your key takeaway today, folks. If you don't take anything away from this session, but this, train your evaluators. I've worked with a number of authorities over the years who don't train their evaluators. It's such an own goal, folks. It's such an avoidable risk you're creating there. So please, 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 please. I promise I'll stop talking about it if everybody does it. Train your evaluators. Think of it as an invest to save. A few hours delivering some training could save hundreds of hours and realistically thousands of pounds dealing with a legal challenge in the courts. So yes, train your evaluators. Act transparently. We looked at this earlier in the context of the competitive flexible procedure. It's very, very true, especially of the evaluation. You need to apply the published evaluation methodology, and you need to follow your advertised process. In short, do what you said you were going to do. And again, yeah, just ensure same treatment. Keep written records. This is vitally important, and it's become possibly even more important under the Act. This is because bidders will have sight of the losing bidder's assessment summary along with their own feedback. So again, there potentially is more scope for queries. Keep an audit trail of changes in scores and reasons. Again, perfectly permissible for somebody to change their score between their individual scores and the second stage group moderated score. But you need to have a contemporaneous record of why. So if in my individual score I thought it was 6 out of 10, but then I go to the moderation meeting with Em and Lorna and we describe it's an 8 out of 10, why have I decided to uplift my provisional initial score from a 6 to our moderated score of an 8? Just capture some reasons for that. Bit like our competitive flexible procedure, devote sufficient time and resources to your evaluation process to make all of this properly possible. Evaluation done well takes time before, during, and after, time and effort. So again, I'd say actually most of it is in the preparation in terms of training your evaluators, getting the right questions, getting the right scoring matrix, managing conflicts of interest, etc., etc. Get the right scoring matrix, one which allows you to differentiate between bids, but isn't so rigid that it's difficult to identify which score is warranted each time. And be really careful. Again, it's something I rant about on LinkedIn and have covered in other sessions. Really, really important that you stress test and really scrutinize your scoring matrix and make sure that it's defensible and would stand up to scrutiny. And again, don't I always say to people, a very, very dangerous words in public procurement are, we've always done it this way, or we've never had a problem. Lots of those authorities who end up in court probably never had a problem until one day they did. Follow your own internal rules. So again, your council, your housing association, your authority may have its own internal rules. It's very likely they will. Make sure you're following not just the requirements of the Procurement Act, but also those in terms of things like conflicts of interest, record keeping, as we'll come onto, etc. Make sure your templates, etc., are updated for the new regime. And then also just be polite and empathetic when you're dealing with bidders at the feedback stage. Acknowledge the news will come as a disappointment to them. Just take care with your language, as I say, let people down gently. Moving on to the don'ts then. Don't introduce undisclosed sub-criteria. So again, if you're saying you haven't covered X, Y, and Z, did you actually ask for X, Y, and Z in the question? Did you actually put in the specification that X, Y, and Z was going to be a delivery requirement? Remember, bidders are not mind readers. What is in the evaluator's heads as being important needs to be down on the page in your tender documents, in your specification, in your evaluation questions. Don't take account of irrelevant considerations. Oh, yes, I like this bidder. We used to use them at my last authority. You have to, and we'll come on to this in a moment, you have to nip comments like this in the bud as they happen. Make sure people are trained in advance. It's not a comparison exercise. So, an evaluator shouldn't be saying, oh, bidder one was much better, so I'm going to score bidder two down. The scoring matrix is there for a reason. We're scoring each bid against the published scoring matrix. We're not comparing bids against one another. Don't be afraid to interrupt. As lawyers, procurement officers, commercial people, governance professionals, this is a really important part of our job. So just remember that person sat in front of you as an evaluator. Yes, they might be a subject matter expert in housing maintenance contracts or electric vehicle charging points or software or adult social care, whatever it is the authority is buying, but they are not a subject matter expert in public procurement. So if things are heading off in the wrong direction, like some of the things we've seen on the previous slides, do politely but firmly bring them back on track. As I say, much better to be a fun sponge than end up in a legal challenge. Don't average scores with no consensus reason. That was something we saw in the Bromcom case in recent years. It really needs to be a deliberation and a debate to reach a final score, not a purely mathematical exercise. It can't just be, well, Lorna thinks it's a 7, Em thinks it's a 9, Kieran thinks it's a 4. We'll add those together and divide it by 3. You can't end up with a final score that's like 4.7 or something. It has to be one of a whole number, ideally, that's part of your published scoring matrix. shouldn't be a decimal place because that won't be one of the available scores you've published, I would guess. Don't give a list of positives and negatives when debriefing. You absolutely have to give reasons, but I don't like doing it in this format. So, for example, I used to do a bit of work with an authority, and their existing template was bullet points of things we like, bullet point of things we didn't like. So, as you can imagine, what did bidders tend to respond to? A few hours later, that email would land in the procurement person's inbox, on the list of disadvantages or things we didn't like, with a comment arguing back on each one. So in my experience, this will just get people's backs up, mix it in together, give the feedback in the round. Don't just put in one place, here's all the things you were a bit rubbish at. We'll just get their back up. Don't make it personal. Again, just take care with language. I would never say to someone, for example, dear Kieran, you have been unsuccessful. I would say something like, unfortunately, on this occasion, ABC Bidder Limited has not been successful. So again, it's the company that has lost the bid, not that individual who's maybe getting your letter and a bit disappointed, upset, frustrated, etc. What is the role of procurement in all of this, folks? Don't be a postbox, be a sieve. You're thinking, what's he on about? He's really lost the plot this time. Years ago, when I first started out in a local authority working in procurement, I remember my manager was being very frustrated with someone, and he said to me, Kieran, the problem is they are behaving like a postbox when they should be acting like a sieve. And I just kind of went, oh, yeah, completely agree. And I was like, I have no idea what he's talking about. I'm just going to sort of smile and nod. Over the years, have I since worked with lots of contracting authorities, it has all made much more sense. Bear with me. What does a postbox do then, folks? Postbox is a mechanism for passing on messages. You put in your post, your message, it comes out the other end, it gets delivered to the end recipient. No one intervenes, no one changes the content, no one amends it, no one alters it. It is just the message goes from A to B. Right, what does a sieve do? When we are cooking, in my case, trying to cook, a sieve filters what is wanted from what is unwanted. So if we think about a public procurement process, then what do we want to capture in our sieve? What do we want not coming out the other end? We want in our sieve conflicts of interest, scoring matrices that aren't very good, evaluation questions that aren't very good, evaluators who haven't been trained, poor contract management, breaches of the procurement rules. These are all the things we want to capture in our sieve. So I'll give you an example. If you're acting like a postbox, you work in procurement, someone says to you, hi, Sarah, I'd like to extend this contract for 2 years. Could you write out to the supplier? If Sarah is acting like a postbox, she will say, oh, yes, that's no problem, Brian. I'll get that letter out today. On the other hand, if Sarah is acting like a sieve, she will say, thanks for that, Brian. Do you have the internal approval you could send me for that contract award? Have you taken legal advice on getting a 2-year extension? Is this compliant with the procurement rules, etc., etc.? So again, it's really, really important, particularly in the context of an evaluation meeting, if someone is saying things that they shouldn't be saying, if someone is saying, for example, oh yeah, I don't like this bidder, I used to use them at my previous authority, or oh, I've been nervous about this bidder, they were in the news recently that they did A, B, and C. That is absolutely your time to intervene and be that sieve rather than a postbox. So yeah, I don't want to create an existential crisis for anybody, but remember, you're a sieve, not a postbox. Moving on, it's all getting very surreal there. Our final slot today, folks, we are going to look at record keeping. Why is record keeping important in public procurement? Record keeping helps to explain the decisions you have made throughout the procurement process. And if you don't have records, contemporaneous records, it's going to be very, very difficult to explain decisions made, particularly over the passage of time in terms of someone saying, particularly as can happen in the court cases. This can be a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago if it goes to the Court of Appeal. Why did you make that decision? You may not know unless you've got a contemporaneous record. If you don't have those contemporaneous records, it's going to be unlikely you're able to fully explain your decisions. And the provision of reasons has been a really important obligation in public procurement, linked to what we looked at earlier around transparency and equal treatment or same treatment of bidders. But yeah, the provision of reasons has typically been a really important public law duty in the public procurement context. Again, as we've seen earlier, There isn't an express duty of transparency under the Procurement Act, but we do have that new objective around sharing information. Why else is record keeping important? You will need records to populate the various notices required throughout the procurement life cycle. As I'm sure those of you on the front line at the coalface will be aware, there are lots of new notices required under the Procurement Act. So you will need records in order to publish those notices. And there are specific legal requirements under the Act regarding record keeping, which are set out on some of the next slides. Poor record keeping increases the likelihood of a successful legal challenge. And again, I've set out on the next slide a number of cases from the previous regime which illustrate quite starkly that point. What have the courts said about record keeping? The courts have said there are a great many good reasons to keep records. A great many good reasons to keep records. This first quote, folks, is from the famous challenge from Energy Solutions to the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. It's actually a decade old now, which makes me feel old, but lawyers love this case. It was a really good example of how not to run a procurement. So we've been dining out on this one for years. Nearly every training session I go to, they always talk about this case. But anyway, yeah, really good example of how not to run a procurement. But one of the pitfalls in this case was some brain box thought, well, if we don't create any notes, then no one can criticize us, no one can challenge our records. So they were shredding the notes of the evaluation, which was a terrible idea. This is what the court said. I cannot think of any reason why a body such as the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority should have contemplated shredding any documents created in this procurement competition. There are a great many good reasons to the contrary, justifying why no shredding should have been contemplated. It is perhaps necessary only to identify the most important one, namely the obligation of transparency. So lots of reasons why we should keep records, but the most important one is the obligation of transparency. And as we've seen earlier in the guidance for the new Procurement Act, the process by which you award a public contract must be transparent. This is another quote from a famous case on evaluation. It remains my view that a procurement in which the contracting authority cannot explain the reason for its decision fails the most basic standard of transparency. That was the Lancashire Care legal challenge against Lancashire County Council by Lancashire NHS Foundation Trust and Blackpool Teaching Hospitals. Yeah, really emphatic, important comments fair from the courts as to how important record keeping is. What does the Procurement Act require then? Well, there's actually no express requirement for a written report, unlike our Regulation 84 report, some of you will recall from PCR days. However, such a report covering the same topics and some of the matters set out on the next slides is likely to remain a good idea. There is a requirement in Section 98 of the Procurement Act that says a contracting authority must keep such records as the authority considers sufficient to explain a material decision made for the purposes of awarding or entering into a public contract. That's Section 98(1) of the Procurement Act. So you must keep records of comms with suppliers, and you must retain records for 3 years from the date of contract entry. What are some of the key records in practice then that you should have in place? So I've broken this down into specific sections of the procurement process as we go through in chronological order. So at our pre-procurement stage, when we are designing our procurement, these are some of the key records I would suggest you should have in place. Individual conflicts of interest declarations. So again, that'd be people like evaluators, but not just evaluators. That could be people who are involved in designing the specification, any external experts you may have involved in a particular procurement. It could also be the people responsible internally for authorizing or approving, contract award decisions, etc. So make sure you've got your individual conflicts of interest declarations. Make sure you've got your conflicts assessment. Again, you have one conflicts assessment for the whole procurement, so your individual declarations feed into your overall conflicts assessment. Pre-market engagement activity and associated decision making. And I think, as we looked at last time, it's a good example to publish the outcome of your pre-market engagement with the tender packs. That could be a link to a recording or a link to FAQs that were raised on the day for if there was an open day for bidders, etc., etc. So I'd like to have also records of your pre-market engagement activity and decision making around that. Public Services Social Value 2012 considerations. That is where you have to consider how what is being procured can improve the economic and social well-being of the local area. So that would be something to document. How are you designing your process with that in mind? You also have your new Section 12 objectives in the Procurement Act: value for money, maximizing public benefit, sharing information, acting with integrity, etc., etc. So again, this is a duty to have regard to the importance of these things. So what better way to demonstrate that you've had regard to something than a written record of that, oh yes, we considered how this procurement was going to achieve value for money. So it's really, really important. The have regard duty, folks, it's a duty concerned with process rather than outcome. So make sure you're capturing that process in your written records. Things like decision reports, business cases, strategy reports, approvals, whatever you call it, whatever you do at your authority, just make sure you're recording that consideration of those Section 12 objectives. Remember also the NPPS, and bombarding you with acronyms here, the National Procurement Policy Statement, and also SME barriers and whether they can be removed or reduced. Those are also things I would encourage you to capture in your internal forms and decision making. Remember also that whether or not you're going to use lots, if your contract is suitable for lots, but you're not using lots, remember that you now have to explain that in your tender notice. So therefore, when you're designing the procurement, that should be another standard inclusion on your form, your business case, your procurement strategy report, whatever it's called, at your authority. Are we going to use lots? If so, why not? Or if not, if so, why? If not, why not? And then that will give you, getting back to our earlier point, that will give you the information you subsequently need to populate the notice. And remember your internal approvals in terms of, do you have authority in place to commence the procurement? Do you have approval to award the contract, etc., etc.? As we mentioned earlier, it's not just about the Procurement Act, it's also about internal governance and complying with your own internal rules. Anybody who is connected with me on LinkedIn will be aware, I've published over the past few years, in particular, a number of councils who have had quite embarrassing reports published about failure to comply with their own contract procedure rules. I can think of at least 3, possibly even 4 councils over the past 2 years. So yeah, take care of that. And depending on the outcome of the consultation we had earlier in the summer, you may also in future need to document decisions to outsource. We don't yet have that, but there may be in future an express requirement around, a public interest test and why we are outsourcing rather than delivering the procured services or goods internally within our authority. So that's the pre-procurement stage. Then what about post-receipt of tenders, including evaluation and moderation? I would encourage you to record the reasons for disqualifying any bidders. So for example, if it was because they're abnormally low, I would set out, why did you consider it was abnormally low? What investigation did you undertake? What representations were received from the supplier, etc., etc. Likewise, if it was applying an exclusion ground, did you give the bidder an opportunity to show that they had self-cleansed, etc., as we looked at in one of our previous sessions? Any clarifications or correspondence with the bidders and associated internal deliberations. So looking there at the case, for example, of Optima versus DWP, Court of Appeal case from earlier in the year, that was around, whether certain price elements have been left blank within the bid. So it was, again, decisions and correspondence around whether or not to clarify with bidders. Can everybody just make sure you're on mute, please, folks? Thank you very much. Individual evaluator scoring and reasons. That's really important, as we looked at in our segment earlier on evaluation. And then also your group consensus scoring and reasons, and then also being able to explain that journey. Why did Lorna agree that she was going to downgrade her score? Why did Em agree she was going to uplift her score? Why did I agree I was going to downgrade my score? These are the kind of things we would want to capture, in between our evaluators. And also then records of any training given to evaluators. As I said, and remember, that's your key takeaway for today. No legal requirement to train your evaluators, but it's an eminently sensible step to take, folks. Can just avoid a real potential own goal if you don't train your evaluators. So that's some of the key records I would encourage you to have at that stage of the process. Additional records if you're running a competitive flexible procedure, copies of any bidder presentations. We saw earlier in the some of the potential pitfalls from the provider selection regime case regarding that. Records of any negotiation or dialogue, minutes of meetings, things like that. Records of any other additional stages. So, for example, site visits, product demonstrations, whatever it may be. Just essentially, you would want to record that in the same way you would have a written record of a kind of paper bid, or well, it's not paper nowadays, but you know what I mean. What about then the contract phase? Remember that the Procurement Act expressly defines procurement right in Section 1 of the Procurement Act to now expressly include contract management. So we would want to have KPI performance monitoring. Remember that certain contracts above £5 million, we must set at least 3 KPIs. There are a number of exceptions. For example, it doesn't apply to light touch contracts, but the general expectation will be that most contracts above £5 million awarded under the Procurement Act, you would set at least 3 KPIs, and you then need to publish at least once a year a contract performance notice where you rank the bidders against those KPIs. So you'd want to have records of contract performance and contract performance monitoring. You would want to have record of modifications and why they are compliant. And remember the new contract change notice that's needed in certain circumstances, and that it now must be published before you make the change, not after you make the change, as was the case with some of the Regulation 72 notices under the previous regime. Internal approvals for those modifications. So a bit like earlier, who has approved that that modification is compliant and can be made. And also then any performance issues or breaches of contract, because one of the other contract performance notices we have is around, partial termination, or where the authority is not satisfied with performance, having given the supplier an opportunity to improve. So I would particularly important to have records where things are going downhill in terms of what's happened, what steps did you take, what steps did the supplier take, what was the legal advice, etc., etc. So that concludes my presentation for today, folks. I'm just going to stop sharing my slides, and I will see, do we have any questions? Do you think, Emma, is it just best to go back to the start of the sort of chat?
Yeah, let's do that, Kieran. There is a few questions in there. So, is there such a thing as too much detail in the competitive flexible procedure?
It's a really good question, Stephanie, because I think the problem of being vague is, then I think it makes it difficult to follow the process you've set yourself if you haven't really actually described something in sufficient detail. Problem perhaps with being overly specific then is you're tying yourself in quite tightly, in terms of it then becomes increasingly important that people follow the advertised process to the letter. So if your process is very specific, then yes, I think there is potentially a thing as too much detail. What you also have to remember is the more detailed, the longer your tender documents are. And we have, as we've touched upon, these new duties around considering SME barriers and whether they can remove or reduce them. So it's a really difficult one, Stephanie, but I think it's probably a bit of a balancing act between not enough detail and too much detail. And it's getting that sweet spot in the middle of where you are being clear, but not necessarily, saying absolute overkill. Here's a 200-page invitation to tender. So it's all about striking that balance, I think. But it's a good question.
Next up is what's considered appropriate proportionate in terms of the competitive flexible procedure? Do you think it will ever really be tested through the courts?
It's a really good question. I suspect not in the short term, and I'll explain that. So, we'll be aware, many of us on the call. So, in public procurement, you generally have 30 days to bring a legal challenge. Now, for obvious reasons, most legal challenges come at the back end of the process in terms of, someone's not happy because they didn't win. They're not happy with the scoring. They think there was a conflict of interest in favor of the winning bidder, etc., etc. Now, if you imagine if you publish your ITT and you set out your process is going to how your process is going to work. If someone is not happy that that's not appropriate, as you say, it's not proportionate, they've only got 30 days to challenge. But remember, no, that 30 days would probably be arguably, there's a good chance that's before the deadline for bids. So realistically, people don't tend to challenge at that stage. So, if for example, you publish your ITT for a competitive flexible procedure, and then you're not actually issuing your assessment summaries to 3 or 4 months down the line, well, by that stage, any claim would be time barred. So for that reason, no, I don't think we will see this go before the courts particularly soon. But then again, it could happen in the future. We'll see. But because of that time bar issue, because if you've explained in your ITT, here's what we consider appropriate, really, if anybody's not happy, they have to do something about it then. If they bid, then arguably, it's a bit like, the bit in a wedding when they say, speak now or forever hold your peace. If they bid, then arguably, they've went along with it. And by the time if they want to come back later and say, no, we weren't happy with that, you can say, well, look, your 30 days is up. You should have complained at the time. So for that reason, I don't think we'll see much in the courts about this. In terms of SME buyers, what is your guidance for financials, insurance, checking capacity, etc.? I know Lorna is going to circulate. We did cover some of those in more specifics and conditions of participation. So I'd probably look back at that. But really, just as a general observation is, don't set the bar too high. Do speak to your insurance people, and they say, right, we need this insurance. Do we really need that insurance? Does it really need to be that level? Again, do just have that balancing act in terms of we're not being, people can tend to be risk adverse, but which is fine, but also then not having many bids is a risk, not having many good bids is a risk. So I do always kind of politely try to say to people, do we really need these 5 types of insurance I've never heard of? Is it proportionate, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a good question. Can the tender notice and description of the CFP refer back to the ITT? I think it probably can, stuff. I need to check specifically how this is phrased. I suppose arguably if you say in the tender notice refer to the ITT, then arguably is that in the tender notice? I suppose it is. Again, there'll obviously be a sensible limit on what you can actually put on the tender notice, but it's worth having a look at the procurement regulations 2024 will set out for every single notice the legal minimum in terms of what it can contain. So it's look in there. There are specific rules for a tender notice for a competitive flexible procedure. So it's worth just having a look in there and seeing, just making sure you are covering, the mandatory legal minimum level of detail. Question for a moment. Why does the CFP allow site visits, presentations, etc.? The ability to record these and robustly score capable of defence these does provide many challenges. I think we may be cautious about using these. Yeah, absolutely. You probably gathered I'm not a massive fan of these. The presentations thing, unless it was something where again, maybe it was like you're buying this new AI tool. It's actually, you kind of need to see what it does to decide if you like it and it's any good. But if you are, for example, running a procurement to buy laptops, tables, chairs, professional services, whatever it may be, I can't say I'm particularly inclined to start having lots of presentations. Those cases I mentioned were just kind of snapshot of some of the issues. And it is something also that the public procurement review service has received complaints about in the past. That's the sort of mystery shopper has received complaints about presentation stages. So yeah, look, apply each case to its individual facts, but I'm not generally rushing out to say to people, yes, you should have a presentation stage. It just can potentially introduce more problems than it solves. If a tender has been rejected following an intermediate assessment, should they receive an assessment summary? Mindful this would exclude the winning tender. I'll double check this, Stephanie. So do take this with a sort of health warning. I think the answer is no. I think the answer is that you only get an assessment summary if you've submitted a final tender. It is worth just double checking that on the guidance. But also then I would either way, if that, assuming that is the case, which is say do just double check that. Um, I would also make sure you are giving them a level of detail because of the the issues we've looked about in terms of reasons, duty of transparency, new objective of sharing information in section 12. So I would still make sure, even if the law says they don't require an assessment summary, make sure you're giving them some level of detail. Under Annex C, how do you work with multiple suppliers to R&D solution with managing confidentiality, different IP across multiple without reaching risking confidentiality and IP? Um, Yes, it's a good question, Carl. I think I probably one which I would need to give some thought to. But yeah, absolutely. I think you're thinking along the right side, right ideas, and you do need to be careful in terms of what your ITT is saying about these things, but also, as you say, how you're managing these in practice. Because do remember also that contracts above £5 million now need to be published. So you would need to think. I know you're looking at this in terms of the procurement stage, but also once you award the contract, you then need to publish it. If it's worth £5 million, so you would need to look at potential redaction, but that is subject. I think it's section 94 of the Act. 94 and 92, I think it's 94, but there's a section essentially about when you can redact. So some of the general principles of that may be useful during the procurement process also, but yeah, certainly one a kind of tricky area, as you've identified, that needs a bit of thought. When we include the successful bid information in the assessment summary, do we share it with all earlier eliminated participants from the previous rounds? Let me check that, Istvan. Let me double check what the guidance says on that. If there are any changes after the design stage, for example, R&D from the original tender notice, do we need to update any information in the original notice? I think that should have been on one of the earlier slides, but I think the answer to that was yes, essentially. That should be something that they would need to be looking to do. What rules are there about dialogue during pre-market engagement phase and any guidance on equal treatment? Can anything backfire on you during or at award stage about the pre-market dialogue engagement phase? So the general principles apply, Carl, at pre-market engagement phase in terms of, same treatment, sharing information, acting with integrity, etc. You obviously don't have the rules that you have in the tender process about changes. So, for example, if you do market engagement, you think, right, we're thinking of having social value at 10%, and the market says to you, actually, no, this isn't really suitable, or it should only be 5%, or let's go for 20%, you can make that change quite easily. Whereas, as I say, if you're mid-process, making changes like that is more troublesome. But there are no real specific rules about dialogue in particular at that stage. The kind of commentary in the CFP document I mentioned is about dialogue during the actual procurement. Can anything backfire on you at award stage about the pre-market engagement phase? A bit similar to M's comment or question from earlier, I think, is as long as you've been transparent in your tender documents about the pre-market engagement, any claim should then be time barred. Because remember, it's 30 days from them having knowledge of the breach, that risks or cause them loss or damage. So if you've said, here was the pre-market engagement conversations we had when you published the ITT, when you come to award, the 30 days for them to bring a challenge should, touch wood, have gone. A few questions about copies of the slides, which Lorna and Em will kindly pick that up. Another few questions just about that. Is it necessary to have more than one evaluator if the evaluator is an SME? I try and have more than one, Stephanie. I think it's best to get a range of opinions. If you have one person, you're not getting that diversity of views. It's also then, on a practical level, what happens if that person has to go off work? What happens if there's an issue? What happens if it turns out there's an allegation of conflicts of interest? you know, I would generally try and have a range of people. That's generally the conventional wisdom. Some of those cases I mentioned, you know, some of the high profile HS2 challenges, there were only two evaluators for some stages. In one of those cases, there was three evaluators. I must say three is a number I quite like as a starting point. But yeah, I generally try and have more than one, but again, you know, it's sometimes the art of the possible in terms of you know, getting the right mix. Are there any good training packs, guidance you're aware of relating to evaluator training and record keeping? Should training be specific to each procurement or general? So there is a government bid evaluation guidance note, which I can send a link to when we're circulating the slides. It is good. I think hopefully when I'm delivering training to evaluators, a lot of those kind of things I said, you know, sort of things to do and not do. I think that kind of thing is helpful because it's kind of practical and it's giving people real life examples. So I would usually try and build in something like that. But really, I would say what each authority needs to do is just create something yourself, you know. And as I say, if you go online, your law firm webinars, articles, barristers' chambers, there will be information out there. And as I say, that government guidance. But that government guidance note would say it's probably more detailed than you'd want if you're training your evaluators. You want to just slim that down, ideally, to key points. What's your guidance for managing abnormally low tenders? We'll probably run out of time for that, but I think it's really just making sure people know how to spot an abnormally low tender, and again, just having, you know, training and internal discussions about that, and then also just, you know, once you've identified a potentially abnormally low tender, is, you know, making sure you've done that investigation. You know, don't just kind of launch in, give them a chance to explain why the scoring is what it is. There's a few other question there, folks. We don't want to complicate a procedure if it's not necessary. Absolutely. Completely agree, Emma. And then just some feedback. Thanks very much, everybody. Nice feedback there. Glad you've enjoyed the session. Any questions we didn't get to, we'll try and cover in the next session if possible. Conscious it's been an action-packed session today. Thanks very much, everybody. Hopefully we got to cover a few of those questions. I'll come back on that one that Esteban had asked about whether you need to go back and give people the assessment summaries. But yes, thank you very much for your time, and I will look forward to hopefully seeing you again at our next session in the series. As Em says, we've got you know, quite a few sessions. So this is the third. This is the third of six, is it, Emma? Five or six?
It's the third of six. So it's been
Third
a
of six,
brilliant.
so
Yeah, it's been a brilliant session again. The next one will be on the 18th, and we'll be looking at the debrief stage. So assessment summaries, contract award notices, the standstill period, and tender notices. So that eagerly awaited that one. So yeah, we look forward to seeing you again, Kieran. So yeah, if anyone wants to contact myself or Lorna about the slide pack, or if they've got any colleagues to invite, yeah, please get in touch. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope weather stays good for bonfire night for you. And thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure as always.
thanks, Em, and thanks again, everyone. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.